Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Pat Kerrigan. I'm a Managing Director and Head of Human Resources for Credit Suisse here in Asia Pacific. I'd like to welcome you all to a panel that I believe will give us a real insight into a topic that's already dominating the world headlines and will continue to do so as 2012 goes on, namely the United States presidential elections. It's no exaggeration to say that the policies of the US government has a profound and far-reaching influence on international relations, the global economy, and the financial markets. In an increasingly interconnected world, the results of this November's elections will be felt throughout Asia-Pacific and the rest of the world. Most Asian economies have been quite resilient over the last 3 years, but there's no question that growth in this region is still closely connected with exports, and the US remains home to the world's largest economy and consumer sector. Those of you who invest in this region know that US politics and economics are a critical factor in asset allocation decisions. Choices made in Washington may affect electronic manufacturers in Japan, Korea, China, and Taiwan. They can affect the availability and cost of capital in companies in India and Indonesia, and they can influence the values of currencies from the Australian dollar to the Korean won. It's my privilege to introduce our two expert speakers this morning who will act as our guides to the election process and how different political outcomes might influence US policy. One is a former Democratic governor and senator, and the other served in President George W. Bush's cabinet. They are both US political veterans with an acute understanding of how elections are won and lost and how policy is made on Capitol Hill. Let me first introduce Senator Bai, who was the US Senator for Indiana between 1999 and 2011, and a two-term governor of Indiana between 1989 and 1997. A Democrat, Senator Bai worked in a bipartisan manner in the Senate to seek consensus on several key issues, including financial services reform and health care. He was also a leading voice advocating restraint in government spending. Allow me to also introduce Grant Aldonis, who was President Bush's Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade and Executive Secretary of the President's Export Council from 2001 to 2005. Today, he co-chairs Governor Mitt Romney's working group on foreign assistance and is actively involved in the campaign on international economic policy matters. While working in the Bush administration, Mr. Aldonis advised the President on international economic matters, helped develop the administration's trade and investment strategy, and led efforts to promote US exports and investments globally. Finally, I'd also like to introduce our moderator for this panel, Joseph Seidel, who is Credit Suisse's Head of Public Policy for the Americas and our own resident expert on US politics. Please join me in welcoming Senator Bai and Mr. Aldonis to the AIC.
Now, thank you, Patrick, for introducing our panel. And as you said, I'm Joe Seidel, head of the Washington office for Credit Suisse. And just as an opening couple of comments here, I think that some of our colleagues were just talking about it yesterday in terms of why should a U.S. election panel be important to Asia, what's the importance of it, why should we be interested in it. And I think among other things, as Patrick has outlined, I think one thing to highlight is that we are really at a key moment in a number of areas in Washington right now on a very granular level. While we are certainly the fiscal situation is at a critical time and there's almost no ability to further kick the can down the road, I think in a number of areas of what I would call unfinished business of the Obama administration, in healthcare, in Dodd-Frank, in energy, environmental policy, the old adage that politics is people and people are policy is really what's important in this election cycle, and in terms of who the faces are, who the bodies are, ultimately executing these policies are just absolutely going to be critical in sector after sector over the next couple years. So I think it really does matter, and while often elections are said to be the most important in a generation, this really will define a lot of the industry, particularly in healthcare, financial services, for a generation to come. I am going to turn it over now quickly. I think just two additional comments to Patrick's introduction. I think we are extremely lucky to have the panelists we have today. I think Senator Bai, would he been able to ever have gotten through a Democratic primary in U.S. election, probably would have been the favorite in the last two presidential elections we've had. So I think his insights, he's been always a terrific senator to work for, and I think in the private sector he has really got tremendous insight and analysis. And Grant is probably the single living expert on China policy on the Republican side. So with that, I will turn it over to Senator Bai, and he'll give us some brief remarks and turn it over to Grant. And our goal will be to get the audience engaged and answer as many questions as possible.
Well, Joe, thank you very much, and I'm particularly grateful to you for your willingness to risk your credibility by saying such nice things about me.
No risk. Low risk.
And Patrick, low risk.
Yeah, with politician.
Nothing is risk-free. That is true. And Patrick, thank you for your very kind introduction. You were being so nice, though. For a moment, I was beginning to get worried. I felt as if I was listening to my own eulogy. But I'm grateful to you for all those kind remarks. I will do my best to be non-senatorial today. For those of you in the audience who are familiar with the United States Senate, senators are famous for speaking at a great length, and I will try and not do that here today because I would really much prefer to have a nice dialogue and answer your questions. So let me try and just give you a brief synopsis of how I see the political landscape today in the United States, and then we can hear from Grant and then get to your questions. The key macro thing to remember about our election is that this will be driven by economic concerns and by concerns about the size of the deficit and the debt in the United States. Neither are good right now, which means that there's a very unsettled political climate in my country. Let me just give you some data points. In most of the recent polling, when asked about the direction of the country, more than 70% of the American people feel that the country is not heading in the right direction. When asked about the state of the economy, and it's improved somewhat over the last several weeks, but still, roughly 70% of the American people do not feel that the economy, the single most important issue to them, is heading in the right direction. Housing prices, which are America's single largest asset, housing prices have gone down substantially over the last 3 years. We may be in a period where the prices are stabilizing, but still they are lower than Americans have become accustomed to. The price of gasoline has gone up significantly. The cost of college continues to go up. Healthcare costs continue to rise at about triple the underlying rate of inflation. So you take all of these things together, and there is existing in the United States today what we call middle-class squeeze. Real wages have not grown very robustly, so there is a great deal of anxiousness and anxiety about the state of the American economy right now. The deficit is still north of $1 trillion. Our debt-to-GDP ratio has risen substantially in the last few years, and when you ask independent voters, the voters in the middle who can go back and forth, what their largest concern is, they list the economy number one, but the deficit number two. So they are quite concerned about the fiscal standing of the United States right now. You combine all of this together, and when asked the question, and Americans by definition are a very optimistic people. We always feel that the future will be better, our children will inherit a better tomorrow than we inherited from our parents. But that's begun to change. When asked the question in recent polling, and this is quite significant, do you feel that the future will be better than the past in the United States? A majority of Americans, for the first time ever, even during the Great Depression, they said, yes, they think the future would be better. For the first time ever, a majority of Americans say no, that they do not believe that the future will be more prosperous in the United States than the past has been. That is a major psychological sea change among the American people, and it is now affecting our politics. Let me just give you a few data points there. In polling out over the last week or so, the president's job approval rating, when asked, do you think the president is doing a good job, it was as low as 41% in the New York Times poll. It was about 48% in the Washington Post poll. In the average of polls taken across the country, it's 47, 48%, something like that. Ordinarily, when an incumbent political figure is below 50%, more people think they're doing a poor job than a good job. That is a sign of electoral vulnerability. The president is in that zone of vulnerability right now. But he looks like a rock star compared to Congress. When asked for their impression about how Congress is doing, a whopping 9% of the American people give Congress a positive job approval rating. Now, poking fun at Congress is as old as the American system of government, but historically, people like their own congressman or woman. They say, well, Congress as a whole isn't doing too well, but I like my senator, I like my congresswoman. Not so much right now. When asked if they could eliminate the entire Congress, including their own congressman or woman, now a majority of Americans, 53%, say yes, get rid of them all, let's just start over again. Gridlock in Washington is too much, we just need to clear house. So it is a very anti-incumbent environment. And this has been going on. So economic underperformance, the deficit, the debt, all this has bled over into a pessimistic mood in the country, and incumbent politicians are paying the price for that. My own belief is that we are on the cusp of the fourth consecutive anti-incumbent election. In 2006, there was a great deal of disillusionment with the Iraq War. So people voted against the party of the president, the Republican Party at that time. The Democrats did very well. 2008, following the financial crisis, the economy was in free fall, largest downturn in the economy since the 1930s. Once again, the public voted for change, voted against President Bush's party. The Democrats swept in. Just 2 years later, the pendulum swung dramatically back the other way. Voted against the Democrats. The Republicans sweep in. The Tea Party is ascendant. To give you one fact, the president in 2008 won independent voters, those middle swing voters, by 9% for the Democrats. Just 2 years later, they voted by 14% for the Republicans. In 2 years' time, there's a 23% swing in how independent voters felt. So what does all this mean now? We have divided government. The Democrats control the presidency and the United States Senate. The Republicans control the House. So if people are mad, if they're unhappy, if they're worried about the economy, how do they vote for change? Who do they vote against? The answer is they vote against them all. And so what you're likely to have, let me start with the presidential race. It is likely to be very negative, very expensive, and very close. The president won 4 years ago by only 5%. Only 5%. The factors are not quite as favorable today as they were then. But I give him a slight advantage. If my life depended on it, I'm very glad it does not. I would say the president probably would win by about 2%, something like that. Each side, it was Mr. Romney will almost certainly be the Republican nominee. Each candidate begins with a guaranteed 47% of the vote. So this whole election is being fought over 6%, no more than 8%. That can go back and forth. Why do I give Barack Obama the advantage? Number one, the Democratic Party is united. If you look at each of the last three incumbent presidents who lost their re-election attempt, George H.W. Bush in 1992, Jimmy Carter in 1980, and Gerald Ford in 1976. In each case, there were significant divisions within the party of the president. George H.W. Bush was challenged by Pat Buchanan. President Carter was challenged by Ted Kennedy. Gerald Ford was challenged by Ronald Reagan. And so there were significant divisions within their parties. Right now, the Democratic Party is united. Barack Obama is not being challenged within the Democratic Party, so we can count on a solid Democratic base on which to run. The opposite is true in the Republican Party. This has been a very negative, expensive, protracted process in the Republican side. As a matter of fact, the Republican candidates are beating each other up, basically making the president's case for him. And in some pretty important places like Florida and Michigan and some other swing states where things were looking good for Mr. Romney, after the primaries, things weren't looking so good. His popularity rating is what we call upside down. By that, his popularity rating is lower than his unfavorable rating. And among that key group of voters, those independents, he is really struggling because of this protracted primary process. The economy is healing slowly. That helps the president. And finally, I think he will run a campaign very much like President George W. Bush did in 2004, when the day that President Bush was reelected, only 48% of the American people thought he was doing a good job. But he got 52% of the vote. How did this happen? He was able to convince that key 4 to 5 to 6% that although they weren't completely happy with him, John Kerry was just not an acceptable alternative. I think that is the kind of campaign you will see the president running against Mitt Romney in the fall campaign, and that's why it will be negative on both sides. And so I give the president a slight advantage. Couple things to keep your eye on. Number one, gasoline prices. If we see a geopolitical event in the Middle East, for example, if the Israelis decide in August that the Americans are distracted with our campaign and they decide to take action against Iran's nuclear program, and you see a spike in oil prices to up north of $150 a barrel, that would have a real political impact in our election. The second thing, and this is a certain thing, there will be a third-party candidate on the ballot in all 50 states. There is a group called Americans Elect. They've spent about $20 million to qualify for the ballot. We don't know who they're going to nominate yet. If they pick someone who draws disproportionately from the Republican voters, that will hurt Mr. Romney. If they pick someone like a Ralph Nader, who in 2000 cost Al Gore the election, that will hurt President Obama. We won't know who they're going to nominate until June. This is a major factor, and in an election that could go one way or the other by only 2%, who this group nominates will be very important. Keep your eye on that. Just to conclude quickly about Congress, I think the House of Representatives will remain in Republican hands. I think they will lose a few seats, but retain control. The Senate, where I served for 12 years, my father served before me, the Senate could be 50-50, very close. The Democrats currently have a 53-47 advantage, but we have more vulnerable seats. I believe the Senate will come down to 3 states. I think the Republicans will pick up 3 or 4 seats, enough to gain control, but it comes down to 3 states where the Democrats have a chance to pick up a Republican seat. One is Massachusetts, one is Maine, the other is Nevada. If the Democrats can win 2 of those 3, they will retain control. If they only win 1 of those 3, the Senate very well could be split 50-50, and Mr. Biden, if the president is being reelected, will be voting a lot because the vice president casts the tie-breaking vote. Final thing, I think we will probably have divided government, which has historically in my country led to gridlock, but there is a confluence of events that are taking place that I think will mean that the beginning of the new administration and the new Congress could be quite active. All of the Bush tax cuts expire on January the 1st. Across the board spending cuts go into effect that would be particularly damaging to the Defense Department automatically on January the 1st. And we will once again be bumping up against the debt ceiling, and America will be at risk of defaulting on its debt. None of these things can be allowed to happen, but all of them will automatically happen if Congress and the President don't do something to keep them from happening. I think the confluence of these events will bring extraordinary pressure on the political process, and that they actually will get the job done. It'll look very ugly, but sometime in February or so, we will begin to put ourselves on a better fiscal path. But the political situation will remain volatile for quite some time. So that's my take on the election.
No, thank you, Senator. Grant?
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Evan. I was kidding, Joe. This is the risk of having 2 Midwesterners on the panel, because I agree with virtually everything that Evan said. But
would you please tell my wife, Grant?
The Big Ten panel.
Exactly. But to just add a couple points, you know, the American electorate is uniquely angry about things that just don't work. And in one sense, a lot of what the campaign will be about is trying to link the other side to what doesn't work and what's not constructive. And it's one of the reasons we're going to be having a very negative campaign. Ironically, which I'll come back to, I'm as optimistic as Evan is about what that actually means in terms of making progress on some very substantial economic issues. But, you know, when you think about elections, you think about the quality of the candidates, the sort of political and economic narrative that's running up to the election, the money, frankly, in terms of who's got enough to campaign and make their points, and then certainly about who's mobilizing their base. So just ticking through those. If you look at the candidates, you know, with Obama, there's a lot of disappointment on the left with Obama, and I think a lot of uncertainty in the rest of the country about who Obama is and what he represents. It's not abundantly clear. He's somebody who's very reserved as an individual and really has not, to this day, defined himself in a way that's easy for people to point to as a touchstone. Equally, on the other side, I think with Romney, particularly after the Illinois primary yesterday, a big win, certainly clearly going to be the Republican candidate, but equally unknown in that sense, that there's a suspicion about what his core values are among Republican voters. You can see that reflected in the fact that a very conservative element in the Republican Party really refuses to endorse his candidacy, which you see in sort of primary after primary. But it's going to be very interesting, because what that is going to lead to is an effort on the side, both sides, just as Evan was suggesting, to characterize the candidate in a sharply negative way, try and link them as much to the negative aspects of their party as it is to critique them individually. So certainly an effort among Republicans to link Obama to the left wing of his party, and certainly an effort by Obama, which has already started, to link Romney to the right wing of his party, even though the right wing doesn't embrace Romney as the candidate, ironically. But in terms of the broader scope of politics, I think that's the way it'll work out. The political narrative is one where overall there is an antipathy to a lot of what brought us to the financial crisis. That is an overhang in the marketplace. That'll certainly be one of the issues. In the economic narrative, on the other hand, things are brightening. The reality is that the unemployment numbers are coming down. Consumer demand has at least begun to stabilize. And you're not going to see, we're still going through that process of deleveraging household balance sheets. You're not going to see a big uptick. But overall, the trend is positive, which favors the president at the end of the day and not the Republican challenger. If you look at the money, Republicans lead right now actually in fundraising. The president has tapped most of his large donors at least once. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic unfolds, again, since so much of this depends on your ability to characterize the other guy in negative terms. And then lastly, on the base, obviously there's on the left disappointment with the president. On the right, not a very wholehearted support for Romney as a candidate. And the real issue comes down to exactly what Evan said. You know, if the president succeeds in linking Romney to the right wing of his party, there's an awful lot to mobilize the base in the Democratic Party at that point. So you can see why Evan was saying it's going to shape up to be a very, very negative campaign. Now, why am I as bullish about the outcome? The irony is that there's so much on the table in terms of the tax policy on autopilot. We're going to end up with the reinstatement of the Bush era, elimination of the Bush era tax cuts, the payroll tax cut deduction, sequestration on the budget, the automatic budget cuts, the debt ceiling debate, where depending on Treasury's borrowings and the performance of the economy, we may actually see the debt ceiling debate resurface before the election rather than, which everybody had intended when they reached a deal last summer, to postpone until after the election. But there's a lot on the table. And my own experience working on the Finance Committee putting together tax and trade legislation is you need a lot of items on the menu to make a meal. There's a lot of items on the menu. There's a lot of ways within the different factors that are there, whether it's entitlement reform, tax reform, grappling with the budget issues generally, that allow you to satisfy constituencies on both sides. And so the pressure will be there to get something done. Ironically, there's enough on the table that allows you to get things done and find a compromise. So I'm actually more optimistic about the fiscal situation. The one downside to this is that there is a sharp divide between the two candidates and their ability really to lead in terms of America's global engagement. I worry more about the president's ability to do that. He hasn't demonstrated that in his first term because he's been limited by constituencies in the Democratic Party that are, you know, if not protectionist, certainly not willing to have the United States engage in terms of trying to write the rules of the global economy in a way that would be positive for growth, things like that. Republican side, you have an embrace of the opportunities that globalization creates, but I was struck in conversation with Evan earlier today where, you know, President Obama, who is unfettered by the fact he's not going to face election again, may find that he's got a lot more room politically. But that's one issue to watch going forward in terms of whoever is elected, whether the United States in one sense can once again come back to the table, actually start to be helpful in terms of not only pushing back against protectionist measures, but actually continuing the liberalization that's unfolded for some period of time. Lastly, in terms of outcome, I'm a little more pessimistic about Republicans taking the Senate, I think, than Evan is, the way it's shaping up, and particularly with Olympia Snow's decision to retire and who's going to be running in Maine. And I think that does affect the outcome on the margin on some issues. but not about the core issue about where we're heading in terms of our fiscal situation. I think ultimately, like I say, there's enough on the menu to make the meal, and we're going to find ourselves in a position, almost regardless of which way the Senate goes, to be able to make that happen. The pressure's there. Implications for specific industries, I think, on housing, certainly more of an instinct among the President to oblige banks to engage in a foreclosure solution, deeper support for GSEs, less so on the Republican side, so you can see where the outcome would go on that, particularly because in a lot of those issues, the President doesn't need Congress. He's got the authority to act in ways that would shape housing policy. On energy, certainly restraints on a Democratic candidate that Republicans don't have in terms of trying to encourage greater production domestically, a little less sensitivity among Republicans on the environmental side, greater sensitivity among Democrats. Finance, given Dodd-Frank's passage, like healthcare, the President will feel obliged to embrace and defend that as a part of his legacy. The Republicans elected, if it's Romney, we're going to be rethinking both Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank in some fundamental respects. And then on defense, you know, one of the interesting things there is the equation is going to change anyway because we're unwinding the engagements in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So almost regardless of whether it's a Democrat or Republican, if you're thinking particularly about defense industries and what might be happening there from an investment perspective, we're going to be retrenching on the defense side. And much more of what we focus on are going to be things like, as we were discussing earlier, Evan, cybersecurity, rather than doing what we've been doing previously, which is still worried about the Soviets coming across the Fulda Gap in terms of a lot of what we've been funding on the defense side. So look for big changes on the defense side as well. So that's where I'd stop, Joe, in terms of both the outcome and then I think what the implications are for particularly opportunities.
Okay. Well, maybe then we'll open it for questions, and maybe I will just ask the first question, following up a little bit on what you were just mentioning in terms of the implications, Grant. Maybe starting with you and then turning to Senator Bai, so you don't have to just agree with them. You can form some views of your own. But what do you think? You know, typically, you know, at the beginning of an administration or at the beginning of a second term, the President throws his weight behind 2 or 3 signature items. I mean, you've outlined sort of where it would mean in terms of regulatory agencies, regulatory policies, but what do you think will be sort of his signature things that he throws his weight behind, that he stands at the White House bully pulpit and really pushes for? And then, Senator Bai, what will be sort of the 3 items you think are on the Obama administration's second term agenda?
Well, ironically, I think that the thing that's out there that he has been pushing and will continue to push is both the environment and in terms of green technology and what he thinks that will be in terms of jobs. I happen to think that's a mistake, but that certainly seems to be where his heart is, and he seems determined actually to encourage continuing investment in alternative energy, things like that. So I expect that that's actually going to be fairly prominent in terms of what he tackles. For
Governor Romney, though?
Governor Romney, really I think it's going to be unwinding health care, unwinding where we've been on Dodd-Frank and Sarbanes-Oxley, but it'll be a deregulation agenda in some respects, Joe, where you're opting to try and take the weight off of allowing the market to operate in a way that would promote growth.
Senator Bai, the legacy?
Yeah. Anytime you're in the president or governor, one of these executive positions, and you're in your final term, you begin to think about legacy items, and you face things that you have to do and then things that you would like to do. Under the have-to-do category, there's the whole constellation of fiscal issues. But therein lies some real opportunity for the president and for both parties in Congress if they can just reconcile some of these differences for just a brief period of time. And I think market forces will probably put great pressure on them to do that early next year, as both Grant and I were suggesting. Something like sweeping tax reform, both at the corporate and the individual level, weeding out some of the individual deductions and exemptions, which is called broadening the base, getting the marginal rates down to make us more globally competitive, trying to increase the rates of domestic economic growth. That's a real opportunity for both parties. And it would be a legacy item for the president, just as it was for President Reagan and Bill Bradley when they worked together on these things back in the 1980s. We're on an unsustainable path fiscally as a country. We're heading in the direction that Europe has preceded us. This can't continue. And stabilizing the country's finances, it's probably not the reason he ran for president, but that would be a historic accomplishment at this moment in time and would lay the foundation for a more robust economy with all the good benefits that would bring later on. So that's going to be the first item on the agenda because it has to be, even if that's not the thing that he gets up first thing in the morning thinking about that he wants to do. Mm-hmm. On the want-to-do issue, and you can recall President Bush, the thing that he said that he wanted to do at the beginning of his second term was Social Security reform. And even members of his party controlled both houses of Congress. Didn't work out quite so well. So on the want-to-do list for the president will be some things that Grant mentioned. I think that he would like to get cap-and-trade legislation enacted with regard to the environment. No way that's going to happen with this Congress. So he'll attempt to achieve much the same result through regulatory policy and have the Environmental Protection Agency come down with regulations that are so onerous and so draconian, it will send many of the affected industries to the Congress, who would ordinarily be saying to the Congress, please don't pass cap-and-trade legislation. Instead, they'll be saying, you've got to pass something to save us from this out-of-control EPA. And so they'll attempt to use regulation to leverage legislation, ultimately, in the global warming sphere. Put me down as saying that that's less likely than likely, but I think he'll attempt to do something like that. The other two items, Grant mentioned both of them, will be to flesh out and to really fulfill items that were enacted during the first administration. The first is the health care issue. And by the way, we neglected to mention, at least I neglected to mention, the Supreme Court will be hearing a case with regard to the health care law. If the Supreme Court strikes down the health care legislation, particularly the individual mandate, this could, which requires every American to now purchase health insurance, this could have a big impact on our political process. I'll take 10 seconds to describe this. Health insurance companies are now, under the law, required to insure people. They can't refuse to insure you because you have what is called a pre-existing health condition. So they have to insure you. If the Supreme Court says that you as an individual don't have to buy insurance, you can wait until you're sick, well, guess what's going to happen? Only sick people will buy health insurance. Well, this is going to drive health insurance premiums through the roof. There will be no healthy people left in the risk pool. And so you will see an absolute chaos break out in the health insurance markets in the United States of America. Believe me, this will have huge political ramifications. We don't know what the Supreme Court is going to rule. It probably comes down to what a single justice, Anthony Kennedy, thinks, and we're just going to have to wait to find out. But that's another big unknown out there. The final thing is on both health care and the financial regulatory bill, my guess is that the administration has been making some accommodations to be more pragmatic and moderate with the election coming up. Once the election's over, they may be more doctrinaire, more liberal, less accommodating on both the health care law and financial regulations, which will mean lower profits for participants in both of those industries.
Okay, questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Do we have microphones or work left to right?
I have one question for Senator Bai and one question for Mr. Aldonis. Senator Bai, I was wondering what your thoughts are on filibuster reform, whether you think it's a good idea, whether it'll happen, and whether it'll help solve some of the gridlock. And for Mr. Aldonis, I wanted to ask you about Mitt Romney's had a lot of fiery rhetoric on China and has discussed the idea that he was going to label China a currency manipulator. And I wanted to know what you thought about if Mitt Romney becomes the next president, what that will mean for the U.S.-China trade relationship.
Can I give you my 45-minute answer on filibuster reform? Did I really speak too long here this morning? Is that what put this on your mind? Well, look, for those who don't follow our politics, the word filibuster basically refers to the right of every individual senator to speak for an unlimited period of time. So if you want to stop legislation, you can just talk and talk and talk. It used to be back in the old days, the 1950s, for example, there were maybe 1 or 2 filibusters per year. Now there's 100 per year. And everything gets filibustered. And even presidential appointments, at the depth of the, well, that's something called the hold. Senators do that too. And so that gums up the work. Judges are held up. At the depths of the financial panic, when we were trying to stabilize the global financial system, wide swaths of the Treasury Department were vacant because the Senate wouldn't confirm any of these people. I mean, it's madness. So to answer your question directly, I believe strongly that we should have filibuster reform. I could go on and on talking at great length about what that ought to entail. Back in my father's time, it took 67 votes to stop a filibuster. that was subsequently reduced to 60 votes following the civil rights debates. You know, I can argue that you ought to have, you know, keep it at 60, but after 2 weeks, reduce it to 55. After another 2 weeks, reduce it to 50, simple majority, something like that. Or you could require senators to actually stand on the floor of the Senate, like in the Jimmy Stewart movie, and physically conduct a filibuster to make it personally uncomfortable for them. For example, I mean, eventually you have to answer the call of nature, right? So that would limit the filibuster. Oh, here's an interesting idea. The burden is now placed upon senators who want to stop a filibuster. We have to get 60 votes to cut them off, right? You could have it the other way around and require 40 senators to come to the floor of the Senate to actually support a filibuster. That means they couldn't do this anonymously anymore. So there are a whole host of good ideas. The short answer to your question is absolutely. I think that the prerogatives of single senators now are making it too difficult to do the country's business. We're on an unsustainable path. We're in a rapidly changing world. The Senate needs to be modernized.
Just on Romney's comments about China, I think, first of all, it does reflect a frustration that you see across the board with China's trade policy and industrial policy. If you think about the policies of indigenous innovation, for example, that have the effect of, rather than forcing Chinese companies to earn their way up in a regional value chain that serves a global customer base, they're trying to force their companies up. And they're doing things like trying to force companies to cough up their technology as a condition of investing in the country or trading with the country. So under those circumstances, there's reasonable grounds to be frustrated with China. And there's always going to be friction in the relationship. I think ultimately what that friction relates to is whether or not China is willing to assume responsibility for the international trading system from which they benefit, or whether they want to continue to be a free rider in it. Now, as to the specifics of naming China currency manipulator, you know, one thing I know based on my conversations with Mitt Romney is he knows that simply calling countries names is probably not going to work any better than it did when we were all 7 and playing in the schoolyard. But there are serious issues that underlie that. A good example would be, if you think about it, the inefficiency of China's capital markets lead to the production of capacity that spills out into global markets and becomes trade friction. If you think about a government that refuses to discipline its own government procurement process in terms of IP violations and what that reinforces for the rest of industry in China about the permissibility of engaging in IP violations, those are serious issues that we actually have to tackle with China, which I think Romney grasps. But on the other hand, you know, the sheer question of the currency manipulator, it's hard to think of something that would have less consequence ultimately. And, you know, I mean, in my own personal perspective, not Romney's, is Ben Bernanke is doing a pretty good job of manipulating the currency on the other side of the ledger at this point. So I think it's better to look at it as a reflection of a certain amount of frustration. Now, having said that, the developments in China, particularly recent political developments, it does hopefully reinforce the idea that folks who are interested in China's progress and its continuing reform are coming to the fore even in the succeeding generation that will come with the transition. And that offers the opportunity to grapple with these issues. Because the truth is, from a U.S. perspective, we have no interest in anything other than a growing China and trying to work out our relationship and seeing China involved in a much more consumer-driven economy, rebalancing our own economy in response to that. That's the positive outcome. And I think both candidates grasp that that's what has to happen.
Yes, sir.
I had a question about tax policy. From what I understand, a lot of Republicans have signed on to the Grover Norquist philosophy of no tax increase under any circumstance. And some people tell me that maybe enough Republicans would go along with the idea of changing that view if there was a big tax reform package where tax rates come down. Challenge with that is if tax rates come down, the wealthiest would benefit from that. So there's 99% of the population in the United States that's angry about the wealth differentials. So if you both had to guess on what the actual plan that gets signed looks like, what would it be?
My guess is it would be something, we've had a number of commissions that have looked at this, and whether it's Bowles, Simpson, or some of the others, I think it will be something like that. I mean, you can look at the UK, even you know, it's a coalition government, but it's led by the conservatives. They had 75% spending reductions, 25% tax increases. So I think it would be a combination of both, more spending reductions, particularly in the entitlement. The thing that's eating the federal budget alive are the healthcare spending in Medicare and Medicaid. Social Security needs to be stabilized, but the big money is in healthcare. And that's politically also very difficult. That's why it hasn't been done to now. But I'd say more spending reductions, including entitlement reform, but some tax increases. Some of it will be covered under the guise of tax reform. The economists tell us, the OMB, the CBO all project that if you get the rates down, broaden the base, that will stimulate growth. You generate maybe $1 trillion more than you would otherwise have over the course of the next 10 years. So you use, let's say, $600 billion or so to get the rates down. You use the other $300 to $400 billion to augment the Treasury. It's extra revenue to the Treasury. And you will probably see, my own guess is that the Republicans will eventually give on the marginal rate for people making more than $1 million a year. I don't think it will be $250,000 that the president is calling for, but over $1 million, I think they'll probably give on that. I think the bigger questions are, what about the treatment of capital gains and dividends? My own view, I'm sort of in the pro-growth camp with Grant. I think the best thing we can do at this moment in time is to try and grow the economy. I think we need to try and attract capital to the U.S. So I think it would be a mistake to have those. Some members of my own party would like to treat that as ordinary income. Warren Buffett famously has called for some of that. I think that would be a mistake. I think you'll probably see the rates go up from the current 15%, but the Republicans will probably dig their heels in, and they'll probably stay at the 20% they were until just a few years ago. So that's some tax increases, yes, but more spending reductions, particularly with entitlement reform, and the taxes will probably fall more on people making more than $1 million a year. Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, and I think Speaker Boehner has already sort of distanced himself from Grover Norquist, and I think has provided an awful lot of cover for Republicans, because he knows that we will have tax reform, and with tax reform we're going to have to find ways to help close the fiscal gap. What's interesting about the Tea Party part of the Republican caucus on the House side, it's much more about solving the fiscal problems than it is saying no new taxes. Now, everybody would like to see a cut in spending. That it requires serious entitlement reform. For me, politically, what that means is there's just a lot of things on the table that allow the president to take enough away from reform of personal income taxes, corporate income taxes, entitlements to satisfy his constituencies, Republicans on the same side, even if it means some increase in taxes to help close the fiscal gap. So what does it mean specifically? I think it means that on the corporate side, you end up with a rate coming down to 25%, something like the OECD average. You see us moving toward a territorial system. You start to see cleaning up a number of ways that we spend through the tax code. In the energy area, I don't think it'll subscribe to some of the ideas that the Obama administration has come up with under the claim that it's subsidies for oil, like getting rid of foreign tax credits for Exxon and Chevron who have to operate overseas. But oil depletion allowance, things like that, I could see those things being on the block as a part of it. I think also on the personal side, what you're likely to see is you're going to see a compression in terms of the number of rates. It won't be the 2 that Republicans have advocated, but my guess is we won't see the gradations that we've seen up to this point. You will see us getting rid of the alternative minimum tax in one form or another as a part of that. Certainly, as the middle class has found itself growing up into the AMT, that's become a problem for both parties that both parties would like to address. I also see us limiting deductions. I think we finally start to take on things like in the mortgage interest deduction, probably more through capping who can benefit from it, because, the truth is with the mortgage interest deduction, it's never actually put a roof over a poor person's head, even though that has been one of the ostensible reasons we've done it. I always think of it much like our farm programs in the United States. We say they're all about the family farm. It turns out that the family farm doesn't exist and nobody's benefiting from it, but it's the same thing with mortgage interest deduction. But the big ticket item, as Evan was pointing out, really is employer-provided health care. And the real question is whether employers would like, if they had the opportunity, to get out from underneath the burden of that. I think that does imply some other things that help control costs on health care. And that means entitlement reform and what we do with health care as well as tackling tax reform.
If I could just add one thing, and I should have begun there. The president has a lot of leverage in this because, going back to what I said at the beginning, on January 1st of next year, every American who pays income taxes, not just people in the top 1%, but everybody, people making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year, their taxes are going up automatically. It's already written into the law. So the president he can just say, hey, unless you compromise with me, I'm going to veto whatever you pass or nothing will pass, and so we're going to solve our deficit problem because everybody's taxes are going up. And I think he's going to draw a pretty tough line on that. I think he'll eventually compromise and go to the $1 million level instead of the $250,000 level. I also hope it doesn't come to that because that would be a pretty big hit to aggregate demand. But he's in a pretty strong position because taxes are currently scheduled to automatically go up if nothing's done. So they're going to go up in part. The question is just how much and which ones.
Which I think is, going to Evan's point, it also makes Republicans more malleable because you're staring at a very significant tax increase and you're looking at a 3.5% hit to aggregate demand, which nobody wants to see in the context of the current pace of the recovery.
If you wanted to be really Machiavellian about it, and I don't think they will, I think the better argument is that Grant's right, they'll end up compromising. But if you wanted to be really Machiavellian about it, in the Republican Party, they could say, fine, let everybody's taxes go up. It's Barack Obama and the Democrats doing this to you and the economy. And so one way or the other, I think the next midterm election is bound to be a really good one for the Republicans if you just look at history and a number of other things. But there may be some of them who are advocating for, if the Democrats want to really be big taxers and tank the economy, let them go. I don't think that's what will end up happening, but you may hear some voices that will say that.
Somebody over here. Questions? Well, maybe I will fill in with a couple of my own then here. We have about 5 minutes left. In the last election, if you were talking to people in March of 2008, they would have never thought in a million years that the financial crisis would have been the talk going into Election Day. Just, from your sort of experience and the things going on right now in the world, what would you sort of think or possibly or the prime sort of external event that we may be talking about in September, October of this year that we're not talking about right now?
Well, I already alluded to the possibility of the Israelis taking action with regard to the Iranian nuclear program. I don't know how to handicap that except to say that it's a material possibility. A lot of that depends upon the thinking of Benjamin Netanyahu and Ehud Barak. I think at the end of the day, neither one of them wants to go down in history as the Israeli leaders who stood by and allowed Iran to go nuclear. But what their timeline really is, as opposed to what they're telling us it is, it's really difficult to say. But the longer we go, the more we run toward the end of what they refer to as their zone of immunity in which they have to act before it's too late. So that's a possibility I would keep my eye on. I would look at Egypt. Egypt has real problems. Tourism has dried up. There's no direct foreign investment. They're running through their capital reserves, their foreign currency reserves very quickly. You have a lot of young people in Egypt who are expecting a better economic result as a result of the change in politics there. It's not happening. And so the euphoria of the Arab Spring is very quickly turning to disillusionment and even hostility. Egypt could be a very tumultuous place for some time. Syria, obviously, it's on the front pages. I think what we are looking there is that over an extended period of time, a gradual reduction of the regime on Damascus and the emergence there of a sectarian civil war, which will draw in most of the rest of the region. I think that's more gradual than Egypt. And really across the Islamic world in general, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya is not a very stable place. It's going to be that whole region is going to be unstable for some time. But I would look at Egypt and the possibility of the Iranian nuclear issue first and foremost.
Grant?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think the flip side is something that Evan alluded to, which is the Supreme Court's decision on health care. Depending on how that comes out, legally you could see why Justice Kennedy would not only say we have to impose some limit on the Commerce Clause and its reach, and that also, because of the lack of a severance clause in the legislation, that it brings the whole of the legislation down. You could also see him trying to split the difference, get rid of the individual mandate, sustain the rest of the bill. But as Evan points out, that can't work. And so suddenly you're back in the middle of a healthcare discussion.
Boy, that would be a real October surprise.
Absolutely. And then the last thing, which I never want to overlook, is we could have a strong hurricane season. And there's always the possibility of, something like British Petroleum, in which case you end up with an event that comes out of the private sector that ends up really altering attitudes, particularly when the broader narrative between Republicans and Democrats is Republicans are associated with business, Democrats are associated with the public. And as a consequence on environmental issues, when you see something like BP, it has a tendency to shift things in a democratic direction.
Final thing I'd add to that, if you remember, for those of you who really focus on American politics and you're interested in the presidential race, if you remember nothing else that I've said today, remember the name Americans elect. There's going to be a third-party candidate on the ballot. We don't know who that's going to be. And if you're talking about an election that's, 1 or 2 points one way or the other, whoever they nominate, and we won't know that until June, they're going to begin an internet nominating process, this could really influence the result of the presidential election. Americans elect. Final thing, there was a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United that completely transformed the way in which we raise money for not only president, but for races for Congress. We now have a single individual in my country, a man named Sheldon Adelson, who's a casino magnate out of Las Vegas, who's given Newt Gingrich, he and his wife have given Mr. Gingrich a total of $10 million. He has said privately that he is willing to contribute up to $100 million, personally, one person, to assist the eventual Republican nominee. So it is the wild, wild west of campaign finance, and how many wealthy Americans choose to contribute those kinds of sums of monies and to which parties is going to be fascinating to watch, and we just are not going to know until we get to November.
Okay, we have the red light on, but one last one-word answer, one-name answer. Who do you think Mitt Romney should pick to be vice presidential candidate if he is the nominee for the Republicans? Grant first, you're the Republican. Come on, the red light is on, come on.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, were it me, I'd be looking for a sitting governor. I think he would benefit from having somebody who's had the real-world experience of actually having to work with the legislature under these circumstances, and also someone who resonates with the Republican base in a way that he has not resonated thus far.
There was a time when I thought that a former governor with executive experience, but someone who'd served in the Senate and gotten some international experience would be a good combination. But didn't seem to go that way. So so what do I know? But look, I'm a homer. I would say Mitch Daniels, the governor of my state of Indiana, would be a pretty good pick for him.
I do too.
Well, thank you all. This is a tremendous panel. Just as a little bit of an advert, we do have from the Washington office, we put out an elections piece for external distribution, and we'll be continuing to do that throughout the year. So please, for people, contact your CS sales representative, and they are as part of the library for the program here, and I recommend that to you. And again, terrific panel with Senator Bayh and Grant Aldonis, and we very much appreciate them coming, and thank you.